We are now starting from the 54th shloka of the second chapter. These are shlokas which describe the personality of a self realized soul, and Gandhiji used to read these shlokas every day. And let us say how these shlokas are interpreted by Prabha Duneja in her book, The Legacy of Yoga in Bhagavad Gita. Now, this is in her book, page number 61. Arjuna Uvacha Stithapragnyasya ka bhasha samadhistasya kesava Stitadhi kim prabhasheta kimasita prajeta kim. Arjuna said, O Krishna, what are the marks of the man of steadfast wisdom who is established in transcendental meditation? How does a man of integral wisdom speak? How does he sit and how does he walk? Commentary. In this verse, Arjuna inquires about the characteristics of a person who becomes enlightened and who is firmly established in the consciousness of the transcendental awareness. He requests Sri Krishna to describe the hallmark of that man who has become steadfast in the essential nature of the Supreme Self. Stithapragnyasya means the one who is firmly established in the parajnana, the knowledge of the Supreme Self. Stithapragnyasya means the one who is firmly established in the parajnana, the knowledge of the Supreme Self. Jnana means knowledge. Parajnana means knowledge of the transcendental self. In other words, intelligence and wisdom may appear synonymous, but these two words definitely differ in their meanings. According to our holy scriptures, intelligence stands for buddhi and wisdom stands for dhi. Dhi, D-H-E-E in English, dhi. So the Sanskrit word is dhi. So intelligence stands for buddhi and wisdom stands for dhi, which literally means cultured intelligence. When buddhi stays connected with the transcendental self, it becomes transformed into dhi and later into medha and then into prajna. So buddhi, which is ordinary intelligence, when it is connected with the transcendental self, it becomes transformed into dhi and then medha and finally prajnana. It is the faculty of intuition. It is the purest manifestation of the self. The indwelling consciousness evolves and expresses itself at various levels. These are known by different names as the different states of inner awareness. The individual who is firmly grounded in the knowledge of the transcendental self is called Stithapragna. Anyone who has the experiential knowledge of the transcendental self, he definitely manifests that grace of his inner connectedness in his day-to-day life. So anyone who has the experiential knowledge of the transcendental self, he manifests that grace of his inner connectedness in his day-to-day life. A man of integral wisdom who is ever united in the self makes quick, firm, impartial and very determined decisions. Such an individual is highly intuitive and his discriminating ability is unparalleled. His decisions come from the depth of his heart. His lifestyle becomes a beacon light for others in society. The eloquence of his speech and the careful analysis of his words manifest the serenity of his mind because he remains ever connected with the source of integral wisdom. There is a word in the prayer of the great Gayatri mantra, Dhimahi, Dhimahi, which means let us meditate on Dhi, the steadfast wisdom. Dhi is steadfast wisdom, the indwelling transcendental consciousness. Let's live in the awareness of the Supreme Lord in order to be blessed with prajnana, knowledge of the transcendental self. After Arjuna inquired of Krishna, Krishna replies, which is Sri Bhagwan Vacha, Prajahati yada kaman. Now which one is that? This is the 55th. Prajahati yada kaman, Sarvan Partha Manogata Atmanye Vatmana Tushtaha Stitah Pragnyas Tadochyate. Prajahati Yada Kaman Sarvan Partha Manogatan Atmanye Vatmana Tushtaha Stitah Pragnyas Tadochyate. When a man abandons all the desires of his mind, O Arjuna, when he feels satisfied in the self, by the self, then he is said to be established in transcendental wisdom. दुःखेष्वनुद्विग्नमनाः सुखेषु विगतस्पृहः वीतरागभय वीतरागभयक्रोधः स्थितधीर्मुनिरुच्यते. दुःखेष्वनुद्विग्नमनः सुखेषु विगतस्पृहः वीतरागभयक्रोधः स्थितधीर्मुनिरुच्यते. He whose mind remains unperturbed in the midst of sorrows, who has no longing for pleasures, who is free from passion, fear, and anger, he is called a sage of steadfast wisdom. Then, the 57th shloka. Yas sarvatra nabhisneha tattat prapya shubhashubham नाभिनंदति नद्वेष्टि तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता. यस्सर्वत्रान्नभिस्नेह तत्तत् प्राप्य शुभाशुभम नाभिनंदति नद्वेष्टि तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता. He who is unattached in all respects, at receiving good or evil, who neither rejoices nor hates, he is surely settled in transcendental wisdom. Now the 58th one. यदा संहरते चायं कूर्मोऽङ्गानीव सर्वशः यदा संहरते चायं कूर्मोऽङ्गानीव सर्वशः इन्द्रियाणीन्द्रियार्थेभ्य तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता. यदा संहरते चायं कूर्मोऽङ्गानीव सर्वशः इन्द्रियाणीन्द्रियार्थेभ्य तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता. तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठा. इन्द्रियाणीन्द्रियार्थेभ्यस्तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता. When like a tortoise, he withdraws, which withdraws its limbs from all sides into the shell, he withdraws his senses from the objects of the senses. Then his wisdom becomes firmly set. The commentary. Now let's listen to the commentary. In these verses, Sri Krishna enlightens Arjuna about the characteristics of a person who becomes fully established in the consciousness of the Supreme Self. He starts with the word kama, which stands for the cravings of the mind in the form of vasanas, spruha, icha, and trishna. These are the various kinds of desires and cravings for the possession of riches, comforts, woman, honor, name, and fame. When the mind of a person is haunted by these desires, it wanders in many directions and becomes very restless and unsteady. The person of inner stability becomes busy in taking up new plans and projects. Inner instability. The person of inner instability becomes busy in taking up new plans and projects. His desire of one thing leads to another. When the individual continues to identify himself with worldly desires and inclinations, he gradually loses his conscious connections with the transcendental self. As he drifts away from the indwelling light, he becomes contaminated by ignorance. The conscious separation from the inner wisdom is indeed the cause of inner instability and restlessness. Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that the man of steadfast wisdom is very enlightened. He has the ability and strength to withdraw his mind from the cravings of worldly desires. The man who becomes satisfied in the tranquility of the transcendental self, he rises above the slavery of the desires. He rises above the slavery of the desires. All his thoughts and activities become centered in the awareness of the Supreme Spirit. Since he has no desire for the fruits of his actions, he works very fearlessly and skillfully. The man of integral wisdom becomes a source of bliss and carries that bliss wherever he goes. His enlightened state of mind works like a Deheli Deepakanya. Deheli Deepakanya. His enlightened state of mind works like a Deheli Deepaka Anya, a lamp placed on the threshold, which connects many rooms. This one lamp provides light to all the rooms. A person established in the inner wisdom reflects the peace and integrity of the transcendental self into each and every type of work he undertakes. The nature of the divine becomes reflected in every bit of the work he performs and in every single word he speaks. Such a person becomes an embodiment of peace and contentment. He is free from all attachments, fears, and anger. He has the strength to remain unperturbed in auspicious and or inauspicious circumstances. To live in the enlightened state of mind is like living in eternity. Such an individual knows how to maintain his balance while facing the dualities of life. He does not feel arrogant about his state of being illuminated and also does not worry if he is not rewarded for his deeds. The illuminated one regards pleasure and pain, loss and gain, honor and dishonor as the passing phases of life. He beholds the tragedies and the comedies of life with an attitude of undisturbed tranquility. In relation to this, there is an incident from the life story of Sri Ramakrishna, written by Christopher Isherwood. He writes, once Sri Ramakrishna, who was the chief priest of Kali, of the Kali temple, Calcutta, he made some mistakes during the Durga Puja. The managing committee of the temple decided to get rid of him. Accordingly, one of the temple officials came to Ramakrishna and ordered him to leave at once. Without the least sign of resentment or dismay, Ramakrishna picked up his towel, slung it over his shoulder, and walked unprotestingly out of the room, which had been his home for the past 26 years. He had almost reached the gate of the compound when the temple officials came running after him, crying, "Please stay, we beg you of you to stay." At this, Ramakrishna smiled, turned around, without saying a word, went back to his room, sat down, and continued the conversation he had been having with some of his devotees, as if nothing unusual had happened. This is how the man of steadfast wisdom acts in his day to day life. He lives his life in perennial tranquility of the self. A perfect calmness in attitude, self mastery, and righteousness characterize the life of a self integrated and self realized saint. Perfect calmness in attitude, self mastery, and righteousness characterize the life of a self integrated and self realized saint. The man of integral wisdom becomes very purified and remains perennially settled in the luminosity of the transcendental self. His life is very disciplined, regulated, and organized. His intellectual faculty acts in perfect harmony with the indweller, and his mind functions very concentratedly and effectively. Endowed with such stability and inner contentment, even if he takes an active interest in the world or totally renounces the world, that becomes a matter of personal choice. For example, Rishi Yajnavalkya chose to retire to the Tapovan, while King Janaka ruled his great empire. The king lived and ruled his kingdom as an embodiment of the divine. He was called Vedehi, Vedehi, Videhi, the one who lived a life which was totally soaked in the nature of the Lord. King Janaka always considered his body only a temple of God and a vehicle to perform the worldly activities. It is indeed immaterial where a self-integrated person decides to live or what he decides to do. All his activities are perennially centered in the consciousness of the Supreme Self. He knows how to enjoy the serenity of his silent moods, and he also knows how to deal with the turbulent waves of his mind. He lives in total vigilance of the self and stays very alert about all the information which is fed by the senses of perception to the mind. He knows very clearly and intelligently as what to see with his eyes and what to avoid. He knows what to eat and what not to eat, and also what to accept and what to reject. His life becomes very disciplined. He has the strength to withdraw himself from the sense objects and their enjoyments. Here, Sri Krishna gives an appropriate illustration of the tortoise, which instinctively withdraws its limbs. It's six limbs, four legs, a tail, and a forehead, and a head into its shell for the protection against any visible danger. Similarly, a person who lives in full awareness of the self can ingeniously withdraw his senses of perception and action from all kinds of desires for self-protection and purity. He holds total control over his thoughts and aspirations. Those arise from the sense objects and knows how to withdraw them within whenever he wants to. In the words of Sri Aurobindo, as the tortoise withdraws his limbs into the shell, so these into their source, quiescent in the mind quiescent in intelligence, the intelligence quiescent in the soul and its self-knowledge, observing the action of nature, but not subject to it, not desiring anything which the objective life can give. A man of integral wisdom has the strength to divert the flow of his outgoing thoughts into the indwelling self. and direct his attention into the stability of the Supreme Soul. His life becomes very pure, enlightened, and tranquil, and he carries that peace and radiance wherever he goes. Now, the 59th shloka. Vishya vinivartanti niraharasya dehina rasavadyam rasopyasya param društva nivartate. The objects of the senses cease to exist for the man who does not enjoy them, but the taste for them persists. This lingering taste also disappears for the man of steadfast wisdom on seeing the Supreme. 60. Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramadhini haranti prasabham manaha. Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramadhini haranti prasabham manaha. O Arjuna, the turbulent senses forcibly carry away the mind of even a wise man who is practicing self-control. 61. Tani sarvani samyamya yukta asita matparaha vashohi yasyendriyani tasya prajna pratishtita. Tani sarvani samyamya yukta asita matparaha vashohi yasyendriyani yasya indriyani tasya prajna pratishtita. Therefore, having controlled them all, one should remain firm in yoga. Regarding me as the Supreme, for he whose senses are under control is surely settled in transcendental wisdom. The commentary. Here Sri Krishna alerts Arjuna that in general, when a person withdraws himself from the worldly enjoyments, the sense objects may seem to turn away temporarily, but still the taste for them lingers for a long time. The desires may seem to vanish momentarily, but still the wish to enjoy the sensual pleasures remains dormant in the subconscious mind. This taste lingers in the memory like the light of the twilight long after the moment itself has gone. So it's very important to live in the constant awareness of the self in order to monitor the direction of thought. As in the words of Buddha, those who respect themselves must be on constant guard, lest they yield to evil desires. To conquer one's own self is a greater victory than to conquer thousands in a battle. Sri Krishna calls the senses to be turbulent, which can forcibly disturb the thoughts of a disciplined aspirant. Even the slightest attachment to the taste of the sensual enjoyments can disperse the rewards of the most difficult austerity, which was undertaken for many years. A little inclination to the enjoyment of the sensual objects can agitate and provoke the thoughts of the person who has been striving for self-control. Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that although the springing up of these desires in the mind is quite natural, but the individual's involvement in their fulfillment is very personal. He alerts mankind and suggests to remain perpetually vigilant. Be perpetually vigilant in this respect. In the words of Maharshi Mahesh Yogi, withdrawal of senses doesn't necessarily mean that the senses don't experience outside objects, but that they are not totally engrossed in them to the extent that they transfer to the mind impressions deep enough to become the seed of future desires. Withdrawal of senses doesn't necessarily mean that the senses don't experience outside objects, but that they are not totally engrossed in them. If they are totally engrossed in them, then there's a problem. They are not totally engrossed in them to the extent that they transfer to the mind impressions deep enough to become the seed of future desires. When the mind is mainly identified with the inner being, the senses don't identify with the objects. In the verse 61, Sri Krishna suggests that after having restrained the senses from the sensual objects, the aspirant should seek refuge in the Supreme Indweller. The unity in yoga replaces the old habits with the newer ones, and the inward joy of being surrendered in the self blossoms in all respects. Through the incessant, persistent, and unremitting practice of self-discipline, the individual becomes established in the serenity of steadfast wisdom. 62 and 63. Dhyayato vishayan pumsaha sangastheshu upajayate sangat sanjayate kamaha kama krodho vijayate krodhat bhavati sammoha sammoha smruti vibhramaha smruti bhramshat buddhinashat pranashyati. The man who broods over the objects of the senses develops attachment for them. From attachment springs desire, and the desire that is unfulfilled results in anger. From anger arises delusion. From delusion, the confusion of memory. And from the confusion of memory, the loss of reason, and from the loss of reason, he goes to complete ruin. In the continuation of the previous verses, here Sri Krishna proceeds to tell Arjuna that the downfall of man starts when he becomes engaged and perennially occupied with the gratification of the sensual pleasures of the world. You see, these two verses of the holy dialogue present a new insight to the understanding of life, which becomes primarily subjected to the fulfillment of the worldly desires. Constantly thinking about the objects of senses, strong attachment is generated. And then you say it becomes attachment grows into a longing, desire, and infatuation. When the infatuation for something starts disturbing the peace of mind, the individual is confused and deluded. And finally, you see, the delusion of the mind leads him to the confusion of memory and the loss of reasoning ability. With the loss of reason, he perishes. Though it takes time to describe this order, yet the rise of these propensities leading to the destruction of man are as fast as death caused by an electric shock. Yeah, the process is as fast as death caused by an electric shock. This message unfolds that the downfall of man is indeed rooted in his infatuation for the worldly temptations. E.F. Schumacher writes in his book Small is Beautiful, a man driven by greed and envy loses the power of seeing things as they really are, of seeing things in their roundness and wholeness, and that in that case, his very successes do become his failures. If the whole society becomes infected by these vices, they may indeed achieve astonishing things, but they become increasingly, if the whole society becomes infected by these vices, they may indeed achieve astonishing things, but they become increasingly incapable of solving the most elementary problems of everyday existence. It is true that a person's contemplation of the object of senses is unavoidable on account of his latencies and impulsions. The coming up of the worldly desires in human mind is very natural, but the person's involvement in the gratification of these desires is very personal. In this context, there is an illustration given by a saint. One day, a man, while he was walking back from his office, looked at a beautiful car in a parking lot. Immediately, the desire of having that car flashed through his mind. Gradually, the idea of possessing that car became an infatuation. Every night before going to bed, he looked at his bank balance. The bank statement clearly showed that he could not buy the car. Later on, he decided to apply for a loan. Unfortunately, the loan application was turned down by the bank. The rejection notice made him very angry, and his desire to possess that car became stronger than before. In the delusion of insecurity and ignorance, he decided to rob the car. In the act of robbery, he was caught and sent to jail. It is a fact that when an angry man becomes attached to something, his urge to possess that object becomes an obsession. The burning desire to possess that particular thing deludes his thinking faculty, and the individual loses his power of discrimination, which then becomes the cause of self-degradation and self-destruction. In the words of Adi Shankara, man can be called man only when he retains his competence to discriminate between right and wrong, do's and don'ts. And when that competence fails, man is totally lost and utterly ruined. Man perishes and becomes unfit to realize the meaning of human existence. 64. Ragadvesha Viyuktaistu Vishayan Indriyaischanan Atmavasher Vidheyatma Prasadam Adhigachati. Ragadvesha Viyuktaistu Vishayan Indriyaischanan Atmavasher Vidheyatma Prasadam Adhigachati. But a self-controlled man who moves among the objects of the senses with his senses under control and free from attraction and repulsion, he attains serenity of mind. Now 65. Prasade sarvadukhanam hanirasyopajayate prasanna chetaso hyashu buddhi paryavatishtate. Prasade sarvadukhanam hanirasyopajayate prasanna chetaso hyashu buddhi paryavatishtati. With the attainment of this inner serenity, all his sufferings come to an end. And soon the intellect of a person of tranquil mind becomes established in the bliss of deepest awareness. 66. Nasti buddhirayuktasya nachayuktasya bhavana nacha bhavayata shanti ashantasya kutasukham. 66. Nasti buddhirayuktasya nachayuktasya bhavana nacha bhavayata shantir ashantasya kutasukham. There is no knowledge of the self for the one who is not united within. Ayuktaha. who is not united with him. The transcendental meditation is not possible for the unsteady. And to the unmeditative, there can be no peace. And to the man who has no inner peace, how can there be happiness? Indriyanam hicharatam yanmano nuvidhiyate tadasya harati prajnam vayurnavamivambhasi. 67 this is. Indriyanam hicharatam yanmano nuvidhiyate tadasya harati prajnam vayurnavami vambhasi. When the mind yields to the wandering senses, it carries away the discrimination of the man, just as the wind carries away a boat on water. Tasmad yasya mahabaho nigruhitani sarvashah indriyan indriyarthebhyas tasya prajna pratishtita. 68. Tasmad yasya mahabaho nigruhitani sarvashah इंद्रियाण इंद्रियार्थेभ्य तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता. That is 68. Which one is that? 67 or 68? Which one was that? Tasmad yasya mahabaho. That was 68. Therefore, O Arjuna, he whose senses are withdrawn from their objects, he becomes firmly established in the transcendental wisdom. 69. यानिशा सर्वभूतानां तस्यां जागर्ति संयमी यस्यां जाग्रति भूतानि सानिशा पश्यतो मुनेः. यानिशा सर्वभूतानां तस्यां जागर्ति संयमी यस्यां जाग्रति भूतानि सानिशा पश्यतो मुनेः. That which is night to all beings, in that state the self-controlled man remains awake. When all beings are awake, that is the night for the Muni who sits. Now the commentary. Now let's look at the commentary. After describing to Arjuna about the terrible fall of an individual who broods over the pleasures of sensual objects, Krishna proceeds to tell Arjuna that the lifestyle of a disciplined man, about the lifestyle. Self-discipline is the key to peace, happiness, self-realization and God realization. The cultivation of this quality is of the greatest importance in life, which transforms every possibility into reality. Self-discipline forms the foundation of all types of progress in material life as well as spiritual. It is astonishing how much a disciplined and regulated person can accomplish by methodical working and by careful use of his time. Because he holds sound discretion, quick perception and firm determination in the execution of his plans, a self-disciplined person accomplishes the maximum amount of work with the minimum use of physical energy. The execution of his work is always very enjoyable and pleasant. Such an individual develops within himself the very precious faculties of analyzation, determination and one-pointedness of concentration. A disciplined person lives in yoga and works through the wisdom of yoga. A man of steadfast wisdom who is disciplined in all respects knows how to reconcile the various currents of conflicting emotions in his mind. He lives and moves among the various objects of the senses with a very detached attitude of mind. He has neither any special attraction nor aversion for any one of these worldly enjoyments. It is by the practice of constant self-control he cultures within himself a new and awakened lifestyle which operates under the direct guidance of the indwelling Lord. His entire span of work functions from the core of his essential being. He performs his duties very regularly, efficiently, and relapses back into the stream of transcendental bliss whenever he wants to. In the words of Jnaneshwarji, even as a tortoise spreads his limbs in joy and withdraws them whenever it desires, similarly, when one's senses remain under one's control and do whatever one wishes to, then one's wisdom has attained steadiness. What does it say? Even as a tortoise spreads his limbs in joy and withdraws them when it desires. Similarly, when one's senses remain under one's control and do whatever one wishes to, then one's wisdom has attained steadiness. A self-disciplined individual is always at peace with himself. The cultivation and practice of self-discipline may appear a long and laborious process to an ordinary person, but for an individual who remains firmly grounded in the integral wisdom of the Supreme Self, for him this practice comes very naturally. Sri Krishna has used the word prasada in this verse 64, which literally means the grace of the indwelling divinity. Prasada means the grace of the indwelling divinity. Grace means the manifestation of the inner connectedness. Grace is the manifestation of inner connectedness. It is the love of the Lord being expressed through the individual. When the grace of the Lord descends upon the person, he is said to be established in the serenity of the transcendental soul. In the words of Howard Thurman, whence comes this power which seems to be the point of referral for all experience and the essence of all meaning. No created thing, no single unit of life can be the source of such fullness and completeness. For in the experience itself, a man is caught and held by something so much more than he can ever think of or be, that there is but one word by which its meaning can be encompassed: God. Hence, the psalmist says that as long as the love of God shines on us undimmed, as long as the love of God shines on us undimmed, not only may no darkness obscure, but also may we find our way to other hearts at a point in them beyond all weakness and all strength, beyond all that is good and beyond all that is evil. There's nothing outside ourselves, no circumstance, no condition, no vicissitude that can ultimately separate us from the love of God and from the love of each other. And we pour out our gratitude to God that this is so. It is indeed the benign grace of Supreme Lord wherein the individual secures his strength to overcome the feelings of his attractions, aversions, envy, hate, anger, and lust. He secures his strength. In the verse 66, Krishna glorifies the practice of self-discipline once again and tells Arjuna that the person who has not controlled his mind and who is unsteady surely lacks the meditative ability and is unity with the integral wisdom. Man who cannot concentrate his mind in meditation can never experience the tranquility of the transcendental self. And the one who lacks the experiential knowledge of the indwelling Lord definitely finds it very difficult to attain any peace and happiness in life. In order to attain happiness and fulfillment in life, the quietude of mind is very important. And the quietude of mind becomes possible only by the practice of the self-control and self-discipline. It is the self-restraint born of constant vigilance, and austerity, which brings about the blissful state of transcendental quality and quietude. In the verse 67, Krishna speaks about the calamity that befalls a person who does not practice self-control and indiscipline. He tells Arjuna that when the person's mind follows the sway of the wandering senses, his discriminating ability is carried away by them, as the wind carries away a boat or a vessel on water. The pleasures of the objects of the senses do allure the individual with the false promise of happiness. Those eventually become the cause of, and finally they become the cause of intensified delusion, disintegration, pain, and misery. Such an individual is constantly busy in catching the froth and foam on the surface of the sensual enjoyments and wishes to enjoy as many pleasant sensations and thrills as they can manage to get. In the words of Swami Chinmayananda, the life gets capsized and the individual drowned if his mind is unanchored. If the mind is unanchored and left to be carried hither and thither by the uncertain buffets of passionate sense storms. Therefore, the senses are to be controlled if man is to live a better and more purposeful life, designed and planned for enduring success. He alone is a man of wisdom rooted in joy and bliss, who has completely restrained all his senses from their wild roamings amongst the sense objects. In the verse 69, Sri Krishna gives the description of the sage who is fully awakened, and who remains fully established in the awareness of transcendental self. The Muni who has attained his full control of the sensations of the mind stays awake in the light of the Supreme Consciousness. He stays awake in the light of Supreme Consciousness. He stays awake in the light of Supreme Consciousness, which remains obscure to the ignorant person, who is constantly awake in experiencing the pleasures of the senses. The ordinary person is awake the ordinary person is constantly awake in experiencing the pleasures of the senses and is asleep to the light of the Supreme Consciousness. Whereas the Muni is awake to the light of the Supreme Consciousness and he is asleep, he is not conscious of the pleasures of the senses. A self-realized Muni remains awake in the light of the transcendental bliss, which is like a night for the self-deluded person. For the self-deluded person, it is the night. So the wakefulness of the undisciplined and ignorant man is surely like the dark night for the sage. The hidden idea in this verse is that when the worldly person is busy in useless gossip, flirtations, eating, drinking, indolence, dandyism, debauchery, the self-controlled Muni remains indifferent to that and ignores as if he is in deep sleep. Now this is the central idea, excellently put. Please listen again, I am repeating it. The hidden idea in this verse is that when the worldly person is busy in useless gossip, flirtations, eating, drinking, indolence, dandyism, and debauchery, the self controlled Muni remains indifferent to that and ignores it as if he is in deep sleep. He does not pay any attention and gives no importance to any one of these activities. He remains aloof and witnesses the people who are roaming in darkness and heading further into the ditch, into the pitch of inner ignorance, or perhaps the ditch would be a right word here. The enlightened sage maintains the equipoise in honor and ignominy, in auspicious and inauspicious, and feels sorry for the one who becomes angry and disturbed at the trivial things of day to day life. By using the analogy of day and night, Krishna brings out the implicit comparison between the man of self discipline who lives his life in the light of the self. Live your life in the light of the self. And the undisciplined individual who lives his life in inner darkness. In the words of Swami Shivananda, the worldly minded people are in utter darkness as they have no knowledge of the self. What is darkness for them is all light for the sage. The self, Atman or Brahman, is night for the worldly minded persons. But the sage is fully awake. He is directly cognizing the supreme reality, the light of lights. He is full of illumination and Atmajnana, or knowledge of the self. So Krishna has used the word Muni for the enlightened sage. Mana, mind, is a state of consciousness. When mana becomes liberated from false identification, it returns to its source. It takes refuge in the awareness of the transcendental self and becomes silent. When the mana settles into a mauna, the person is called Mauni or Muni. Now let's see. I'm repeating it again. Sri Krishna uses the word Muni for the self-enlightened sage. Mana means state of consciousness, the mind. When the mind becomes liberated from false identifications, it returns to its source. It takes refuge in the awareness of the transcendental self and becomes silent. When the mana settles into a mauna, the person is called Mauni or Muni. When mana settles into mauna, the person is called Mauni or Muni. Because the mind has become liberated from all false identifications, delusions, and has gone back to the source. 70. Apuryamana pratishtam samudramapah pravishanti yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantimapnoti nakamakam. Apuryamana pratishtam samudramapah pravishanti yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantimapnoti nakamakam. As the water of the rivers enter the ocean, which though full remains undisturbed, likewise the man in whom all desires merge themselves, he attains peace, and not the one who longs after the objects of desire. 71. Vihaya kaman yassarvan pumanscharati nispruhaha nirmamo nirahankaraha sashantim adhigacchati. Vihaya kaman yassarvan pumanscharati nispruhaha nirmamo nirahankaraha sashantim adhigacchati. He who has abandoned all desires and moves free from attachment, and without the feeling of I and mine, he attains the supreme peace. 72. Yesha brahmi sthiti partha nainam prapya vimuhyati sthitvasyam antakalepi brahma nirvana mrchati. Yesha brahmi sthiti partha nainam prapya vimuhyati sthitvasyam antakalepi brahma nirvana mrchati. This is the state of transcendental unity, Brahma sthiti. O Arjuna, having attained this, he overcomes the delusion. Being established in this state, even at the time of death, he attains the supreme blissful state, Brahma Nirvana. Now, the commentary. In these verses, Sri Krishna gives the simile of the ocean while illustrating the calmness and stability of self-realized sage. The analogy of ocean illustrates the spiritual depth and the unfathomable tranquility of the person who lives in the awareness of the Supreme Divinity. As the noisy, turbulent rivers merge into the serenity of the ocean absorbs everything in it. Similarly, the turbulent desires and passions merge into the serenity of a self-realized sage, and he absorbs each one of them without being disturbed at all. The person who remains established in the ecstasy of the infinite absorbs the pains and disturbances of even other people, perfect calmness and tranquility. He handles every moment of life as it comes with a balanced state of mind. In the words of Madhusudana Saraswati, though the ocean receives the flow of rivers, it is majestic and changeless. A wise and stable intellect is similar. Desires don't modify its stability. The awakened state of self-realized person is like an ocean which absorbs all types of disturbances without exhibiting any particular change. The man of steadfast wisdom performs all his duties at home, business, and community, but nothing ever disturbs his emotional equilibrium. The person of integral wisdom, who identifies his happiness in yogic unity with the Supreme Self, he maintains his perennial peace. But the person who identifies his happiness with the passions and the worldly desires, he definitely lives in a very disturbed and disintegrated life. The human nature holds within itself many kinds of conflicting emotions, desires, and passions. These manifest themselves in the conscious or the unconscious behavior. People in general live more by their emotions than by their reason. The ebb and flow of these desires drives people voluntarily and involuntarily into all kinds of temptations, makes their life restless. The pursuit of worldly desires, which generally passes unchecked by reason, is definitely one of the greatest causes of human unhappiness on earth. It is the fact that the worldly desires do corrupt the thinking faculty and denude the intellect. As Buddha described, each thing comes into existence because of prior existence of something else, and with the cessation of one link in the chain of existence, the entire chain would fall apart. The desire, the craving is the key link in the chain. It binds us to misery, which is inevitably associated with the revolving wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. Sri Krishna asserts that the individual can attain peace and happiness in life only when he rises above the notion of his identification of happiness with the worldly desires. You can attain peace and happiness only when you rise above the notion of your identification of happiness with worldly desires and takes refuge in the tranquility of the indwelling soul. The person becomes accustomed to live his life in the consciousness of his ampler divinity. He naturally becomes contented and fulfilled within. There's a famous saying, चाहा गई चिंता मिटी मनवा बेपरवा जिसको कुछ नहीं चाहिए वही शहंशाह. The person who has abandoned all his desires and cravings of the mundane world, he is indeed the richest and the most blessed person. He is the Lord, he is the Emperor. छा गई चिंता मिटी मनवा बेपरवा जिसको कुछ नहीं चाहिए वही शहंशाह. In the verse 71, Sri Krishna makes it very clear that the individual who has renounced his desires and moves about in the world without any attachment and without the feeling of I and mine, he surely attains peace. The first line of the verse indicates the necessity of relinquishing all desires and attachments. And the second explains the abandonment of the illusive sense of individualized separate existence. The sense of I-ness and minus is indeed the cause of bondage. It is a great bane in the pursuit of self-realization. The egocentric emotions and the feelings of I and mine forms a curtain which obscures the vision and the experiential knowledge of the pure indwelling self. As Paul Brunton writes, in delusions of the ego and its ignorance of true nature behind, that which expresses itself in the personal and vertical pronoun I are the source both of the evil it does and the ignorance it shows. Paul Brunton says, in delusions of the ego and its ignorance of true nature behind, that which expresses itself in the personal and vertical pronoun I are the source both of evil it does and the ignorance it shows. Now, in its unchecked selfishness in mankind's worst, selfishness, it is mankind's worst advisor. In order to overcome the pressure of the egocentric thoughts, the individual has to seek refuge in the divine, seek refuge in the divine, seek refuge in the divine. As the wheel of ego lifts itself, the person enters the realm of purity, wherein the feeling of mine is replaced with thou and thine. I and mine is replaced with thou and thine. A person who takes refuge in the awareness of the Supreme Soul with complete surrender, he spontaneously becomes free from the feelings of I and mine. The individual self becomes awakened to the joyousness of its completeness and wholeness. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, moksha is liberation from egocentric thoughts, which is possible only with God's grace. And God's grace comes through ceaseless communion with Him and complete self surrender. God's grace comes through ceaseless communion with Him and complete self surrender. This communion may in the beginning be just a lip repetition of His name, even disturbed by impure thoughts, but ultimately whatever is on the lips will possess the heart. It is indeed a very difficult task to accomplish it in one lifetime, but not impossible for sure. The Supreme Lord's grace is all powerful and self surrender is the best way to achieve it. The quality of humility and the negation of I-ness has been emphasized in almost all religious traditions of the world. There are some beautiful lines by Thomas Kempis. God walks with the humble. Thomas Kempis. God walks with the humble. He reveals Himself to the lowly. He gives understanding to the little ones. He discloses His meaning to pure minds, but hides His grace from the envious and proud. A complete surrender into the graciousness of the divine is the only way to enjoy the totality of life and to enter into the totality of the infinite bliss at the time of departure from the world. Sri Krishna has used the word Brahmi Sthiti. Brahmi Sthiti, which literally means the state of super consciousness. Brahmi Sthiti is the state of super consciousness, in which the mind becomes firmly established in Brahman. It is the oneness with Brahman and Brahmanhood. It is the consciousness of experiencing the divinity within one's own self. It is a state of awareness in which the individual soul recoils back to its true identity and resumes its original status as the Supreme Soul. In the last verse of this chapter, the word nirvana has been used, which literally means the individual soul merging into the Supreme Soul. A fragment merging into the wholeness, an individual drop dissolving into the serenity and the unfathomable depth of the great ocean. Nirvana is the freedom from all false identifications. Nirvana is going back to the essential nature of the Supreme Self, which makes the individual identical with Brahman. Nirvana means total bliss.